Welcome to the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, a podcast about the United States and the world in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I'm your host, Michael Patrick Cullinane. Welcome back to the show. There are a few exciting developments that I can share with listeners. First and foremost, the show has a sponsor. I'm delighted to announce that the Society for Historians of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era have teamed up with yours truly to bring you more varied content on the show. The Society is better known to members as SHGAPE, and they have been around since 1989 as the foremost professional association for historians on this time period. They produce an exceptional journal called the Journal of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. They have a blog, a listserv that gets word out about events, and they are a member of the National Coalition for History, which is a consortium that advocates on federal legislative and regulatory measures. There's a reason why SHGAPE and the show share a common name, and that's because we have the same general mission. We want to share research, create a community of scholars and educated friends, and demonstrate the value of this historical period. So I couldn't be happier that SHGAPE has sponsored the podcast. Now, before I explain what comes of this sponsorship, let me add that listeners can find links to the association, its blog, the listserv, and the journal on the show's website. And most importantly, please consider joining SHGAPE. If you like this show, you'll love the association, you'll love the journal, and you'll love the community. SHGAPE sponsorship has allowed the show to hire an intern to develop show content and gain experience in podcasting. And we're going to be joined by PhD candidate Michael Connolly. He's studying U.S. history and public history at Loyola University, Chicago. He's joining me to conceive of new shows, to read the latest books, and interview the authors. You'll be hearing more from Michael in the coming weeks, and again, my thanks to SHGAPE's leadership and its members for this opportunity to do more with the show. Now, for this week's episode, something a little bit different. We're talking about death and the funeral industry. Studies of death and dying have become almost as popular as medical humanities and environmental studies in recent years. We've yet to feature anything of this subdiscipline on the show, and today we have a real treat on the show because my guest is going to combine the history of funeral parlors, material culture, city planning, and consumerism all in one interview. I am joined today by Dr. Dean Lampros, who teaches at the Rhode Island School of Design, and his book is called Preserved, A Cultural History of the Funeral Home in America. Dean's scholarship is inherently cross-disciplinary, and the book is a vibrant study of so much more than funeral homes. Thanks for coming on the show, Dean.
Thank you for having me.
Well, this was one of the most fun books I've read in a while, and I don't think it's not meant to be funny because a book about funeral parlors is not necessarily one thinks of as being fun, but Preserved is about funeral homes as part of the cultural landscape. And naturally, my first question is, how in the world did you come up with this research topic?
I really love telling this story. So about 20-ish years ago, I was in the master's program in preservation studies at Boston University, and I was working for the School of Theology at the time. And I had been a grad student in American Studies, which is the doctoral program, and I withdrew. I took a leave of absence to go abroad to study music. And then when I came back, I found myself working for BU School of Theology, and I was using my tuition credit to take some classes in preservation because I was interested in architectural history and historic preservation. And we had in the first year seminar a series of guest speakers, one of whom was the ED, the executive director of the Waterfront Historic Area League in New Bedford, Massachusetts, and told us all this great stuff about adaptive use or adaptive reuse, depending on the phrase you use, when buildings get recycled, basically. And all, New Bedford has all this sort of industrial and commercial infrastructure, warehouses, for example, on the waterfront that were being back, 25 years ago, were being rehabbed and converted into all kinds of different things, artist lofts and community spaces, and that basically revitalization of the waterfront. And so I grew up north of Boston, had never been to New Bedford, and was curious to go. And so my husband and I hopped in the car one Saturday, and we're going to trek down to New Bedford. And to get to the waterfront in New Bedford, you pass through a lot of older neighborhoods. some of them are better preserved than others. And in through one of the neighborhoods at the edge of the downtown, there was, it was a neighborhood with some older 19th century, grand dwellings, but a lot of parking lots and a lot of convenience stores and a lot of filling stations. And it's a neighborhood that had undergone enormous transformation over the course of the last 100 years. But you could see vestiges of the old neighborhood there in these grand Victorian dwellings. And I thought to myself, wow, this is so sad. This neighborhood has basically been erased. How little of the fabric remains. And then there, of course, up on a hill, like a little embankment, was a beautifully preserved Italianate residential dwelling from the 19th century. And sure enough, on the front lawn was a sign that it was a funeral home. And the light bulb turned on above my head at that point. I realized that this was a significant part of historic preservation, the history of preservation. This was not an anomaly. Every town in every city in America has not one, not two, probably three or four funeral homes that are housed in what was previously a residential dwelling, and not just any residential dwelling, a grand residential dwelling from the 19th century. I can think of the three or four that existed in the town where I grew up north of Boston. And I knew that this was significant, and I viscerally understood that no one had written about this. It was a hunch, and it was a hunch that proved true when I started doing research. No one had written about the space of the funeral home. Historians of the American way of death, and there are a handful of them, had written about the funeral home as an institution, but not as a space. And really, the funeral home was really kind of a simulacrum for the person of the funeral director and the work that the funeral director does. In other words, that's what the funeral home meant in their writing. They were not exploring the space of the funeral home. They were not exploring the landscape of professional death care. And that's what I found the most interesting. And because it also connected to the history of preservation in the United States, I thought that this was something that I should write about, and my department agreed, and they instructed me to transfer out of preservation studies back into American studies, which I did.
Well, I want to talk to you about American studies and the multi or cross-disciplinary nature of your
Yeah,
work, of which it's
yeah.
apparent. But I just want listeners to pause for a moment. And the title of the book is Preserved. The reason why it's playful is you're writing. The title is obviously a double meaning, preserved being the things that funeral directors do to corpses, and the thing that they're also doing to these homes. But what struck me most about this is that this really is a book about the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, or that late 19th and early 20th century period, because the funeral parlors that are preserved are these residences. So I suppose the question is what made the Gilded Age house such a good funeral parlor?
It's such a great question, and it's really tied to the title. Yeah, you're right. Of course, funeral directors are preserving bodies, and they are also preserving mansions, but they're preserving so much more. They're preserving, in this day and age, they're preserving the tradition of small family-run businesses. Against contrasted to the sort of the global funeral chains, those multinational funeral chains. They were also preserving a housing ideal that valued formality, grace, grandeur, strict separation of rooms and partitions. And that was contrasted with this sort of more relaxed informality, which was also being celebrated by very progressive reformers beginning in the Gilded Age. A new kind of housing was emerging that valued this kind of relaxed informality, and it was the beginning of the open plan that we see today. The open plan wasn't invented in 2000; it wasn't invented in the 1950s. It goes way back to the Gilded Age, when reformers and builders and housing critics were rethinking what houses should be like. The problem is that modern housing in the early 20th century didn't make for particularly orderly funerals. Funeral directors who were still going to the house of the deceased, often to do the embalming in the deathbed. And then later that changed. Families would send the body to the funeral home to be embalmed because they had specialized facilities there. But the body would return to the house for the funeral. And, some people lived in large Victorians, which would have made for, orderly funerals, and some people lived in more modern houses, that would have made it harder for funeral directors. And so for them, the houses, these large Gilded Age mansions that they were acquiring in order to convert them to funeral homes, it made for more orderly funerals for them because these were, for example, they were spaces that allowed you to enter into some kind of reception hall or vestibule or entry hall. The entry hall was gradually disappearing from plans and house layouts, during the first decades of the 20th century. Not in every house, but, you see a lot of house plans where you enter right into the living room. That's tricky for a funeral director who's trying to do a home funeral, where guests are entering right into the main space where the body is laid out. There's no buffer area. That makes for it's very difficult to organize an orderly funeral in that context. And funeral directors were experiencing this sort of spatial disorientation as they're being called to do house calls in more modern dwellings. Now, historians, who've written about the American way of death, they all want to talk about the size of the house. Houses got smaller, and that's actually not true. Houses did not really get smaller during the 1920s and 30s. There were small, modest houses during the Victorian era. I talk about this in my book in the final chapter. And there continued to be large, grand dwellings, colonial revival dwellings during the early 20th century. But houses became less formal. It's not so much that they became smaller, they became less formal. And that's what funeral directors were preserving, a kind of formality that for them made for an orderly funeral. It also allowed the family to occupy for example, a space apart. Today, that doesn't make sense to us. We go into a funeral home, the family is seated or standing very close to the casketed remains. And they're greeting people as they sort of come in the sort of receiving line. Back in the early 20th century, families would sit in a separate room. They would sometimes, for a home funeral, they would sit upstairs. They would sit in a side room that would be closed off so that they could hear the services, but they wouldn't be seen. This to us today, it's so unfamiliar to us because it's not what our experience. It's not our experience, but there were things called family rooms and funeral directors. If you lived in a grand old Victorian, yeah, they might be able to set aside that in your own home, but some people didn't have that space. The houses that they chose to convert into funeral dwellings, they all had a separate space for families. They all had what was called the family room. It was adjacent to the chapel or to the large parlor that they were converting into a funeral chapel. In other words, where the casketed remains would be for the service, there was a separate room for the family. This required separation between rooms. It required partitions, something that we associate with Victorian dwellings, but not so much with the more modern dwellings being built in the early 20th century. Your typical bungalow, for example, has a large living room that you may enter right into from the front porch, and there might be a dining room adjacent to the living room, but there's no door. There are no sliding doors. There might be a set of columns, but it's otherwise the flow between the living room and dining room is what was being emphasized. Funeral directors weren't interested in the flow between spaces. They were interested in separation between spaces. And this is something that Victorian dwellings, Gilded Age dwellings, afforded them, but modern dwellings didn't. But sorry, that's a really long answer to a question, but it's key to the title. It's there in the title of the book. Funeral directors were preserving houses. They were preserving a particular housing ideal, a way of occupying space.
I think it's a good answer. I think it takes us through some of the rooms that you mentioned a lot in the book because the family room and the chapel are big features. But I'm wondering if you could take us for a further walk through some of these spaces, particularly some of the grander houses that you studied, because you visited some of these places and the archives that you've looked at, you've gone through the floor plans in some cases as well. And there's a uniqueness to these Victorian interiors. And perhaps you can share that transition from home to mortuary.
Yeah, I mean, what funeral direct to be honest, what funeral directors found over and over again, I saw in their own descriptions in talking about their spaces and in the conversion of those spaces from dwelling to funeral home. Oftentimes they'll say, very little work was needed. Most of the work would go into creating an embalming room. So that's where there's, either in the basement or somewhere on the first floor. There may be rare examples of second-story embalming rooms. I'm trying to think if I can count it. Maybe some, but rarely. Usually they're basement or ground floor rooms set apart. Those rooms require specialized fixtures and specialized equipment. But overall, the funeral directors found the layout of these Victorian dwellings um, immensely suitable for for conversion to a funeral home, and not necessarily different than the downtown funeral parlors that they occupied. With the main difference being that they were residential dwellings. Look, the main difference between the downtown funeral parlor, which is the landscape of professional death care prior to the residential funeral home, prior to say around 1910, funeral directors are in downtown funeral parlors. And then the funeral homes that begin popping up in the 19 teens, 20s, and 30s, the main difference is the residential setting. It's the neighborhood setting. Yes, the house, of course, there's a difference between a commercial storefront and a residential dwelling, but the types of spaces that funeral directors have in the funeral homes, these are spaces that they already had in their downtown chapels, their downtown funeral parlors. They have a reception room. They have a chapel room, or what they call a service room. They have an embalming room. They have a family room. They have a music room. They have a slumber room. So the slumber room is where the remains are laid, the embalmed remains are laid out prior to casketing. The family has to pick out a casket. The remains have already been embalmed, and so the body is laid out in a bed or on a couch. These are set up to look like, mostly they're set up like bedrooms. Again, this to us is so foreign. We nobody is old enough today to really remember slumber rooms. But downtown funeral parlors had slumber rooms, as did the residential funeral homes. So all of the spaces, all of the components are there, but they're arranged under a domestic roof in a residential neighborhood setting as opposed to a downtown setting. So the main difference is the residential street, but the spaces are all there. And yeah, I mean, funeral directors found, yes, they did work. They would renovate and rehab. Oftentimes they're renovating and rehabbing because the buildings were somewhat neglected. These were neighborhoods in transition. The sort of the wealthier, younger residents are leaving to go in the 1920s and 30s. There are newer suburbs farther out, automobile suburbs. These residential neighborhoods at the edge of the downtown, they're not really suburbs, they're residential sections of a city at the very edge of the downtown. And they're changing in the 19 teens and 20s. They're becoming what one observer called twilight zones. They're still nice, refined areas, but the housing stock is older. It might be a little shabby. It's no longer as fashionable as it was. And this is the funeral directors move into these spaces because they're close enough to the downtown, to churches, for example, and to cemeteries. And they're full of these old houses that are highly adaptable, but they need work. They need to be fixed up, but they're not fixing them up because the layouts are incompatible with the work that funeral directors want to do, or that they're so different from the type of spaces that they had downtown. They're rehabbing them because the houses may be in disrepair.
I did like what you said about some of the houses, how they, I mean, obviously they're not exactly the same as the downtown store.
No,
And also this idea of selling, like, so one of the stories that you tell in the book is about this wood paneled room where the caskets are
yeah.
displayed and then they get kind of filed away behind the wood piling so they can't be seen. I thought that was absolutely brilliant.
And that's very much that is very much a feature. Look, the display room, that's another space I didn't mention. The casket display room, super important space. You have display rooms downtown, you have casket display rooms in residential funeral homes. Downtown, they might sometimes double as the service room or funeral chapel, especially if that sort of paneled wall where you hit a lever or you press a button and then the panel folds down and to display the casket. These are very ingenious systems that were developed. These exist in downtown funeral parlors because the space might be more limited. They have to be more efficient with their use of space, whereas in the residential funeral homes, they have more space. You probably don't see that kind of sort of hidden away casket sort of system, display system in the residential funeral homes, possibly, but they have so much space in these residential funeral homes that they are able to devote, an upstairs bedroom, or one of the large downstairs rooms. Oftentimes these Victorians, they don't just have one parlor, they have a double parlor, plus a large dining room, plus a library. I mean, you've got 3 or 4 or 5 large downstairs rooms in addition to multiple bedrooms. They can set aside a space for a casket display room, and they don't have to hide the caskets away because they need the room to do double duty. In other words, it's only ever going to be a casket display room, as opposed to maybe the downtown parlors, which, yeah, maybe the casket display room is also serving as another type of space. Funeral directors had so much space to use in these residential funeral homes for whatever they needed. They often had a room for guests to stay, in other words, mourners to stay overnight. Again, something we would find shocking. Who would stay in the funeral home today? You go back to your house, or if you're visiting from out of town, you go to a hotel. Funeral homes had spaces for families. They also had spaces for the funeral staff. So their families would live in the funeral home, or a junior staff member might have a bedroom or a small apartment. There's so much space in these large Victorian dwellings that they can do all kinds of things with. And so um, and again, the main thing, these they're able to offer the family privacy. There's so much space that when during the service they're able to offer the family privacy so that they can not interact with the mourners if they choose not to.
Getting back to the caskets, I mean, it's a reminder in a way that your book is about consumption as well, and that
Yes.
this is an industry, and you've mentioned the corporate side of it that's become a more recent phenomenon. But back in the day, these were mom and pop funeral homes for the most part. How did they become emblematic of the wider cultural shift that begins after the Civil War towards a more consumerist America?
I mean, funeral directors are, and they are very open about this. They are taking their cues from the larger retail landscape, specifically department stores. They compare their casket display rooms, the lighting, the layout, the arrangement, also the other cases that they would have for other kinds of burial goods. Again, something that's very foreign to us today. We go, someone dies, yes, you need to go pick out a casket, but that's it. There are no other burial goods. Funeral homes back then had burial clothes, specialized burial clothes that you would bury. Today, you pick out grandma's favorite dress, right? Back then, there were burial clothes. There were other kinds of items. And so they would have display cases as well. And they constantly are comparing these to the display cases in the most modern department stores. They're comparing themselves to other retailers and other merchants in the lighting and the layout and the arrangement. And they want to make sure that they are using the most modern, up-to-date ways of merchandising and arranging their goods. And the funeral home, the residential funeral home, is largely a retail space for the first couple of decades of its existence. People, again, as I said, people go there to buy, to pick out a casket, to make arrangements and pick out a casket. They might eventually even send the body of their loved one to the funeral home to be embalmed. And again, funeral directors were going to the home of the deceased to do deathbed embalmings well into the 1930s and 40s and 1950s in rural locations. So yeah, you might send the body to the funeral home to be embalmed, but then it was going to come back home for the home funeral service, the wake, what we would call a wake. But they're going to they're going to downtown locations, and then eventually they're going to residential locations to pick out the casket and burial goods. So these are largely retail locations. Funeral directors want families to hold the services from the funeral home, and families are reluctant to do this. American families hold on to the custom of the home funeral well into the 1940s, and again 1950s in rural locations. Um, So what does that make the funeral home? It's a place where you go to pick out the casket and maybe send your loved one to be embalmed, but the service is held at home. The body is returned home for the service or a kind of viewing, and then it might go to a church or synagogue for the actual funeral service. Um, and so funeral directors are working with these residential funeral homes that they want to be ritual spaces, but they really are primarily retail spaces for the first couple of decades. And that gradually, obviously, that changes. Today, who has ever? I've been to one home funeral, which I write about in the book. Most people, the idea of someone having the wake of their loved one from their home or the home of the deceased, this would be absurd to us today. Obviously, you would go to the mortuary, the funeral home, the funeral parlor. Americans in the 1930s and 40s, 20s, 30s, 40s, they were very reluctant to give up this custom. It was part of the idea of a good death. A person died at home, and they would be remembered at home. They would be viewed at home. The remains would be viewed at home prior to going to the church or cemetery. So funeral directors they understand that they have retail locations and they're using the most modern methods of merchandising and lighting and display. And in that regard, they're taking their cue from downtown department stores. There's another way, though, in which they are way ahead of the game in terms of merchants and retailers, and that they understand the future of retailing, the future of commerce lies beyond the confines of the downtown. And they are among the earliest merchants, if we can consider funeral directors merchants. And there's a big debate in the funeral industry in the first half of the 20th century. Are we service professionals? Are we merchants? There's a whole debate. And the layout of the funeral home reflects this, depending on how much prominence is given to the casket display room. It's hidden away somewhere, or if they have a haphazardly arranged display room, or if they have a very prominent, well-lit showroom, it shows that they embrace their role as retailer. Regardless of that, funeral directors as a whole understand that the future of business and commerce is beyond the confines of the downtown, mostly because of parking, the availability of parking. The downtown is crowded, it's congested, it's noisy. Cities and towns throughout the United States beginning in the 19 teens and 20s are wrestling with the parking question. There's just not enough room for cars and parking. And so, but downtown department stores hang on until the 1950s and 60s with the development of the first suburban shopping centers and shopping malls. Funeral directors begin leaving Dodge, right? They get out of Dodge in the 19 teens and 20s. They see the handwriting on the wall and they begin going to these residential locations. And I would say that of all the things that draw funeral directors to residential neighborhoods, yeah, houses are bigger. They allow for more space. They have a home-like setting that they can offer their clients. Those things are all true. But what really draws them is the availability of parking, something they just do not have downtown. As cars become democratized, as automobility becomes democratized in America, funeral directors understand that they need a change of scenery. And so they go to these residential neighborhoods and they're bragging about how many cars they can accommodate in these long driveways and in front of the street. They're constantly talking about their ability to accommodate 20, 30 cars, which is something they could not do downtown. And so funeral directors are among the earliest merchants to see this future. And so the funeral home, the residential funeral home, is a sort of both a harbinger and a pioneer of our decentralized retail landscape.
So that's interesting that, I got that point in the book about the automobile changing the nature of the business, and in some ways the automobile may have saved the Gilded Age and Progressive era architecture of rural suburbia. The other question I had, though, was how did technology change the profession as well? I mean, naturally, I imagine things like lighting would have changed remarkably, or even the chemical technologies that would have improved embalming, etc. But the actual industry itself is changing due to technology, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, again, in terms of things like lighting, they're bragging about their downtown parlors. Look, they brag about how home-like their downtown parlors are, for that matter. How home-like could you be in the middle of a bustling commercial district, which is what the first generation of residential funeral home owners are saying about their downtown competitors, because the vast majority remain downtown. These brave pioneers that go out to convert a residential dwelling at the old Victorian neighborhood at the edge of the downtown. And I say brave deliberately because they're all getting sued. They're all getting sued by their neighbors or by the municipality who is suing them, or rushing to pass a zoning ordinance specifically to bar funeral homes from residential neighborhoods. So they are very brave to do this. Most of their competitors remain cautiously downtown. And so the ones that do manage to convert a residential dwelling are bragging about how home-like they are. In terms of technology, the most advanced modern lighting, you see this in the downtown funeral parlors. They're all talking about this from the late 19th century. By the early 20th century, they're all talking about how modern their funeral homes are. Mostly, though, when they talk about modern, whether they're downtown or in a residential setting, they're talking about the embalming room, right? What they call the preparation room. They're talking about their modern preparation, their modern state-of-the-art preparation rooms, the most advanced sanitary equipment in order to prepare and preserve bodies. And this is something that they're already talking about when they're still operating from downtown funeral parlors, and it's absolutely something that they are talking about when they move into residential quarters. Because again, for funeral directors, the first step to sort of dislodging the home funeral is to get the family to send the body to the funeral home for preparation. And some of the bodies will, yes, they will stay there, but the vast majority, as I've said, do not. They then go back home for the wake. But technology, the embalming technology, the types of pumps that are used, for example, the types of cooling tables, the types, all of that equipment, that modern equipment is changing the work of the funeral director, and they're talking about it, and they're talking about it in their advertising, they're looking for any angle they can get to convince families that their houses are not suitable places either to prepare the dead or to honor the dead in a kind of service, funeral service or wake. They're doing their best, and so they might talk about the well-lit funeral chapel, but they also might talk about the family room and how it offers privacy, but they might also talk about the state-of-the-art preparation room. They don't shy away from talking about this in their advertisements or during open houses when the community is invited in to view a new residential funeral home. Now, funeral directors are not going to show their preparation room to someone who comes in off the street, unless even families who bring in their deceased loved ones, they're not going to see the preparation room. The exception to that is these open houses that happen in the 19-teens, 20s, and 30s. A new funeral home opens in the old Jones mansion. Some old prominent family, that house gets converted into a funeral home. It's advertised in the newspaper. News covers these extensively, and the funeral director might, and often did, host an open house. We know that people from the community viewed the preparation rooms because they talk about it. They're quoted in these newspaper articles. How exaggerated are these quotes? I don't know, but there are quotes. Oh, it was so clean, it was so immaculate, it was so bright, the white tile, it was so sanitary. So we know that community members are seeing these spaces. Funeral directors want you to see that space and to see how modern it is and how different it is from the bedroom where grandma might be laid out, where you might say, "Oh, please come to the house and prepare grandma's body." They want you to see the preparation room and how different and modern and sanitary and well lit it is, so that they don't want to go to the house to do the embalming. That's a hassle. It's expensive. It's transporting equipment. As the technology becomes more modern and there's more of it, it's harder to transport to the house to embalm grandma in her deathbed. It still happens, but it's happening less and less by the 1920s and 30s. People give up home. They're willing to relinquish the body to the funeral home for embalming, but they're not willing to give up the home funeral. Not quite yet.
So, Dean, that's interesting that because you've alluded to the lawsuits somehow connected to the preparation room, and you do mention that all of them are being sued by locals because there's this stigma around death in the neighborhood. And your book looks closely. I wanted to give you an opportunity to kind of do a deep dive because Your book looks very closely at the 1920s in La Crosse, Wisconsin, and one case in
I
particular.
love
So,
that story.
yeah, tell us
This
that.
was the this was the most fun chapter to write for me. It's the longest chapter, I think, and it's the most fun to write for so many reasons. I mean, discovering these lawsuits was a gold mine. Coming across references. I think the first references I came to them might have been in the pages of the American Funeral Director where they are discussing these lawsuits. And then, you go and track them down and you realize that there is not one, there are not two, there's not 12, there's dozens of these lawsuits. And so finding them and reading them, it was fascinating. What's also fascinating about these lawsuits is they don't just shed light on how the community viewed the funeral home versus how the funeral director views the funeral home. Funeral directors choose funeral home. They choose mansions for very specific reasons, something we haven't really talked about. I mean, we have talked about, yeah, they want parking. There's it's a kind of grandeur to the residential funeral home, to these mansions, um, that funeral directors want to impart to their work. Right. Funeral directing begins in the livery stable and cabinet maker's workshop. Undertakers are working in the middle of the 19th century. It begins as a trade, as a sideline, as a side hustle to the livery guy or the cabinet maker. They want to shake off those dusty origins, and mansions surround their work with an aura of grandeur and respectability. They want to be a profession as opposed to a trade. And I think it's important to point that out. Why am I saying that now in connection with these lawsuits? Because it sheds light on how they view the space. They view these mansions as statements of dignity and respectability, right? Literally moving from the livery stable to a mansion. And they talk about that transition, how far their field has come, the progress that their industry has made. Neighbors see the funeral home very differently. They do not look at it that way. They are not looking at it through the eyes of the industry. To them, it is a constant reminder of death. And this is the phrase that is used in the lawsuits, a constant reminder of death. And they talk about um, uh, traffic on the street, because there's always, a procession lining up to, for the with the hearse to go to the cemetery. They talk about crowds. They talk about hearing wailing. They talk about hearing mournful hymns. They talk about odors. They talk about flies. They're worried about contagion. The residential funeral home becomes a symbol of contagion in the neighborhood that must be arrested. And it's not just the contagion that comes with bodies being preserved and flies landing in your house, right? If you live next door, it's another kind of contagion. It is the kind of contagion where commercialism is beginning to spread into these residential neighborhoods. And the residents want to stop that. They want to arrest that. And the funeral home to them is a commercial space. It's not a domestic dwelling, and they don't want business in their neighborhood. And so they're suing these funeral homes. So you asked about La Crosse, Wisconsin. Um, what happened in La Crosse is typical of what happened in other places. The funeral director tries to buy a grand Victorian dwelling. The neighborhood bands together buys the house to prevent it from being sold to the funeral director. They do that once. They can't do it a second time. The funeral director succeeds the second time around. Um, and the residential fabric of this particular street in La Crosse was amazing. I mean, it's a grand Victorian neighborhood, upper middle class to wealthy elites, prominent business owners, factory owners, civic leaders live on this stretch of road in La Crosse. That one of the grand houses is a large, hulking mass of a brick building called Pasadena. Elsie Giles Scott occupies it, and she's one of the most prominent critics. She does not want a funeral home 3 doors down from her. They're trying to preserve the refined, dignified residential quality of their street, and a funeral home has no place in that landscape for them. And what's interesting about this is that the funeral directors in court, they engage in this kind of doublespeak. They say, "Oh, no, 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 we're hardly doing any funerals from this. Really, because people are coming to pick out a casket. No one's we do one funeral a month from our residential funeral home." Meanwhile, when they're advertising and they're trying to convince you to hold the funeral of your loved one from the funeral home, they're trying to say how commonplace this practice is, how 60-70% of families are holding the funerals from the funeral home. Which one is it? Which one is it? Is it one a month or is it 60% of families? Right? So they're engaging in this doublespeak. They're trying to, so we're not being disruptive. We're not gonna disrupt the life of the street with large crowds and mournful hymns being played all the time. Um, but they lose. In the case of Lacrosse, they lost. The judge, the case, wound its way through the court system, ends up in the Wisconsin Supreme Court, and they uphold the lower court decision. They uphold the injunction, and the funeral director and his wife are forced. Adelbert and Sophia Miller are forced to vacate a building that they've rehabbed and return to the downtown, where they begin advertising a state-of-the-art, modern downtown funeral parlor with all kinds of home-like qualities, even though it's downtown. And what happens in Lacrosse is that, so this is the 1920s. Throughout the 1930s and 40s, the commercialism that was starting to creep in when the Millers wanted to move to this particular street, this continues. The street is widened. Eventually, Pasadena becomes a YMCA. And then by the 1970s, it's torn down. And so if you go on Google Maps today and you look at this stretch of road in Lacrosse, there is no indication that this was ever a residential street. It is completely commercialized. It has become completely taken over by the downtown. And in my book, I think the last sentence of that chapter is, this transition happened from residential to commercial. Nobody could have blamed the Millers, that funeral director and his wife, because they were kicked out of the neighborhood. And yet the transition to a commercial landscape happened because, if anything, funeral homes preserve the residential character of the street for a little bit longer than it might have otherwise. For a street like the one in Lacrosse that was completely taken over by businesses, where there's a residential funeral home, and you get clusters of funeral homes, right? They cluster together in some of the same streets at the edge of the downtown. This is another thing that funeral directors are preserving. They're preserving the residential quality of streets that at the end of the Gilded Age, as the Gilded Age is coming to a close, these streets are in the midst of a transition, and a residential funeral home might actually preserve the residential quality of these streets for a little bit longer, and maybe even into the present, actually. Streets that were under enormous commercial pressures as the downtowns are sort of spilling over their borders. And so you find in these court cases, the other thing that was so fascinating about them is not just to learn how the public disdain with which they view a residential funeral home on their street. But the other thing that we see in these court cases is these great descriptions of neighborhoods in the midst of this transition. And they're describing these neighborhoods in great detail because the character of these neighborhoods is key to how the case is going to be decided. If it's a neighborhood where there's already an apartment house, maybe a filling station, then the judges are saying, look, this neighborhood's already in transition. A funeral home isn't really going to change that much. But if it's all grand residential dwellings and one funeral home, the judge is going to usually says, look, this is no place for a funeral home, right? So it depends. And so we get these great descriptions where they talk about things like apartment houses and filling stations and small grocery stores. And we get a glimpse of, as the Gilded Age is coming to a close, what these residential neighborhoods at the edge of the downtown, what they look like and how they are changing. And I don't know that there is, there probably are other primary sources that give us that glimpse, but these court cases are one of the most detailed views we have of how the Gilded Age residential landscape at the edge of the downtown, how it was changing in the 1920s and 30s. It was fascinating to read those cases.
Well, and as you point out as well, some of the funeral directors do win over local residents. The lacrosse one is, it goes in the other direction. But I suppose what I was astonished to read most in your book, in one of your later chapters, you mentioned Mark Twain as someone who wrote quite disparagingly about funeral directors, blaming them for profiteering from the dead. And there was, as you point out, I never heard this term before, but you point this out in your book, there was a coffin trust, which, for historians of the Gilded Age and Progressive era, we know about the whiskey trust, the beef trust, Standard Oil. We've never heard, at least I haven't, of the coffin trust. So how does that affect the industry?
Oh, I mean, this is what I was getting at back to before. I mean, there are there are so many reasons why funeral directors want to move to residential neighborhoods. As I said, parking is a big one. They're able to look at these grand interiors of these Victorian Gilded Age mansions with their moldings and their woodwork and their cornices and their grand staircases, and they see the same kinds of opulent settings that were present in downtown department stores. And there is an article of faith that an opulent setting is going to lead to spending. There's a connection between space and spending. Whether that's true or not is not the point. They believed there was a connection between space and spending. So that's another reason they want mansions. But another reason why funeral directors want to acquire mansions is to uplift their industry and to transform it from a trade into a profession. This is what I started to say before. Funeral directing has been a maligned industry from the very beginning. I mean, they were barely out of the livery stable, moving into these downtown parlors when their critics begin this litany of complaints against the funeral industry, and creating the kind of image that still lingers today. Less so today, but it's the image of the funeral director. It's certainly the image that Jessica Mitford picks up in her expose, The American Way of Death, which she wrote and it was published in 1963. There is this caricature of the undertaker as a soulless, greedy, manipulative, a shady character who is preying on families when they are at their most bereaved, marking up the cost of burial goods, upselling families, trying to convince them to sell, to purchase the most expensive burial goods way beyond their budget, consuming entire life insurance policies, on expensive, elaborate funerals. This is the image of the industry that undertakers and funeral, as they begin to change the language, they call themselves morticians, and then they call themselves funeral directors. They're changing the language, what they call themselves. They professionalize in the Gilded Age, in the heart of the Gilded Age in the 1880s. They create a professional organization, the National Funeral Directors Association, which still exists today. And this is one of many industries that is professionalizing in the 19th century. Doctors, lawyers, architects, funeral directors, they're creating professional associations. They're setting minimal standards. They're setting education requirements. They're setting ethical standards. They're hosting a national annual convention to discuss best practices. They're doing all these things to try to uplift their image, and it's not working. It's not working. This stereotype of the shady, greedy, soulless, heartless funeral director persists, and so funeral directors do what so many people have done throughout the ages. They turn to architecture to uplift their image, and they turn to these mansions, these Gilded Age, Victorian mansions that have associations with the town's elite residents. The most respectable residents of the town were housed in these mansions. And so for funeral directors, they want that aura of respectability to surround their own work. And they think that that will work. And of course, it doesn't work. The neighbors look at the funeral home as a constant reminder of death. But funeral directors are trying, they're trying to surround their work with the aura of respectability and grandeur. Now, for Black funeral directors in the United States, this is even more important. African American funeral directors say the same things that white funeral directors are saying. Yes, they want to elevate their industry from the status of a trade to the status of a profession. They also want a grand opulent space that is akin to a downtown department store that's going to encourage luxury, the purchase of luxury burial goods. They want more space for parking. But they also write very explicitly and very specifically about how acquiring mansions that were previously owned and occupied by white elites, when a Black business owner acquires that space, they are uplifting their race as well, and they are undermining the landscape of white supremacy in their towns. One of the funeral homes that I talk about in Birmingham, Alabama, Smith and Gaston, it occupies a grand old neoclassical building that was owned by a white family, and then it was a house for elderly white school teachers. It was a sort of retirement home. The funeral directors, they go in and they buy this mansion. It is across the street from a park that is still segregated, white only, public park, and it's blocks away from Birmingham's Confederate War Memorial, which today, the discourse on these war memorials, both academic and political discourse about them, is that these were monuments ostensibly to the Confederate dead, but they were actually monuments to a racial hierarchy, right? They were meant to symbolize and stamp the landscape with a racial hierarchy. It is this racial hierarchy that Black funeral directors are undermining by moving into grand mansions that were once owned by the town's white elites, and they know it. They are very vocal about it. They're talking about how these were mansions where Black Americans would only ever have been servants, and now they are opening them up to the Black community. And they Black funeral directors use their spaces in more versatile ways. It's very common for Black funeral directors in the South to advertise in the local paper how women shopping can come and use the funeral home as a lounge. They can sort of rest, come in and use as long as there's not a funeral going on, they can use the main reception room to sort of freshen up and rest from their shopping expedition. And of course, Black funeral homes in the 1950s and 1960s are hosting sort of secret and covert civil rights strategy sessions. And so they are very aware, African American funeral directors are very aware of the racial dimension of the spaces that they're creating, and they talk about it.
I just want to add to what you're saying there about race and also religion and sectional and regional variations. This is a big part of the book that we probably don't have a lot of time to delve into, but it's not just an addition, although, it kind of comes through in this interview a small bit as, and things were different for African American funeral directors. This is actually something that runs throughout your book: race, religion, and region. And so I don't want any listener to think that somehow this is a small part. In fact, it's a big part about how you describe the evolution. The other thing that really struck me when I was reading the book, struck me in much the same way as the title of the book, which there's a sort of Black humor to it all. Not Black in the African American sense, Black in the sort of darkness of it all. But the sources that you use are unusual. The professional journals and the magazines of the funeral home industry, they have strange and wonderful names like Casket and Sunnyside, or my other favorite one that I read was Embalmers Monthly. It sounds like a joke, but it's, tell us a little bit.
No, it's not a joke. These are industry publications. There are many of them. There are those there, although we wouldn't use this language today, there's the colored embalmer. So there's that. In other words, Black funeral directors also have their own. So there's a bunch of them. And like any industry, they have industry publications where they are talking about issues related to their field. And because the shift from downtown to residential funeral home is such an important and prominent shift in the 19 teens and 20s and 30s. They're talking about it in the pages of those publications. I was very, very fortunate that Kate Boylston, who still publishes the American Funeral Director, still publishes the trade publication, the industry publication. They opened their archives to me. They have archives in New Jersey. And I made several trips, and I sat in, in a back closet, basically, where they keep these bound volumes. They're all, paper bound volumes. They're not on microfilm. They're not digitized. And I would, turn page after page looking for the articles, who's converting residential dwellings? What are they saying about these spaces? How are they talking about them? And that's where you find all of this stuff. They're talking about merchandising. They're comparing themselves to department stores. They're talking about the elite associations and the symbolic value of mansions for their profession. They're talking about parking. They're talking about lawsuits. They're talking about zoning ordinances. They're talking about all of these things. These industry publications were an invaluable source of information for me, and I cannot thank Kate Boylston enough for opening their archives to me to go in and sit for hours and just read through these and photograph them. And they scanned a bunch of pages for me eventually. And that, along with newspaper, digitized newspapers, digital archives of newspapers, allowed me to do keyword searches, so I could search for articles, both articles about residential funeral homes when they opened, but also advertisements, funeral home advertisements, but also articles about lawsuits as well. I mean, newspapers were also an important source of important primary source for me as well. But when you're in those publications, and because these publications are directed to industry professionals, and so you're seeing all of the equipment that companies are marketing to funeral directors, and so you see all these chemicals that are being used for embalming. You're seeing all of the sort of now I say makeup, sort of different materials to rebuild flesh that has, especially if for disease, in the 1920s, especially, with things like cancer, different types of diseases that might cause the flesh to waste away. I know this gets super sort of graphic, but in the pages of these publications, all of the products used by funeral directors to create a beautiful corpse for an open viewing, those products are advertised. In other words, in addition to seeing articles about residential funeral homes, there are also products that are being marketed to funeral directors in industry publications. And so after a while, at first it's shocking. After a while, you get used to it. You're like, oh yeah, there's another moisturizing cream, or there's another skin filler cream. You see it, and they'll do before and after photos of the body, the corpse, usually the face, before and after reconstruction. And so they're very graphic images, and you get used to seeing them in the pages of these trade publications. And well, they're engaged in the preservation of bodies, of corpses, to make them presentable for for viewing. And in some ways, this story of the residential funeral home begins with this, right? Prior to the Civil War, bodies are routinely not embalmed unless you're royalty. Right? I mean, indigenous people in the Americas had a kind of embalming for for elite tribal members, right? So their embalming has a long history, right? But your ordinary Americans in the colonial period and in the antebellum period, they're not being embalmed. Right? Burials are simple, plain affairs. It's with the rise of arterial embalming during the Civil War, embalming becomes much more common. Of course, they're shipping bodies of soldiers back home. Families want the remains of their sons back, and their fathers and their husbands. And so embalming becomes more common. And after the Civil War, embalming is part of the services that are offered by these professional undertakers. But the fact that there is now a body that is preserved allows for more elaborate rituals. And what ends up happening is that the setting for these rituals becomes a topic within the industry, right? But that only really happens because of embalming, right? Without a body, an unembalmed body will only last so long, right? And so there's less concern about space. Obviously, it will stay at home until it's time to go to the burial ground or the garden cemetery, right? But when you have a preserved body, it allows for a more elaborate burial, and then space becomes becomes more prominent in the discussion of where are these rituals going to take place.
And Dean, do any of these houses still exist? And I mean, I know they do, but are they still used as funeral parlors? Can you bring us like from the Gilded Age funeral home to today? Are they still around, and what do they look like now?
Yeah. Oh God, yeah. So I mean, by the 1980, sort of, I think the residential funeral home peaks in the sort of 1970s and 1980s. By the 1990s, I don't know that there are any new conversions that are taking place. Maybe a handful. Certainly by the first years of the 21st century, I doubt there are conversions. No one's going to convert a mansion into a funeral home anymore. But that said, mansions that had been converted and that were still being, they were still being used as funeral homes well into the 80s, 90s, 2000s, and into the present. You can go into any city or town in America, and you're less likely now, but than say 20 or 30 years ago, but you're still likely to find the mansion that is serving as a funeral home. There are fewer of them for a couple of reasons. I mean, these multinational funeral conglomerates, these chains went in and consolidated, then they shut down a lot of locations as they sort of tried to streamline. Sort of and eliminate competition, and small family-run businesses sold their interest to these conglomerates. Sometimes they stayed on as staff, sometimes they retired, sometimes they realized it was a mistake and they tried to buy the funeral home back from the chain, and they managed. This is the storyline of 6 Feet Under. This is why it was such a popular show, because the main theme of it is this family trying to remain viable and competitive as this funeral home chain moves into the area. This is something that the funeral home continues to symbolize today, the tradition of small family-run business, as opposed to a constant reminder of death. I mean, the meaning of the funeral home has changed from the 1920s and 30s to the 2020s, where it now is a symbol. Nobody thinks of it as a constant reminder of death anymore. I mean, but today it's a symbol of historic preservation. Today it's a symbol of small, locally owned, family-run businesses. These funeral homes and mansions remain an iconic part of the cultural landscape in the United States, but there are fewer of them. There are more purpose-built mortuaries in sort of more suburban locations. These look like you find these buildings. Other than the sign, they could be an office, a small office building. They could be a bank. There's nothing about these. They don't look especially residential. Their main feature is a large parking lot. It's a sort of, usually it's a one-story brick building. There might be, columns or some kind of ornamentation, but they are sort of they're sort of bland commercial. I shouldn't say bland. That's a value judgment. They're not particularly residential in quality, even though they exist in sort of suburban locations. That is the dominant trend of the industry now: purpose-built mortuaries. Now, go back to the 1930s. Purpose-built mortuaries were being built in residential neighborhoods to look like houses. Right? They were, even if you didn't, in other words, if you didn't convert a Victorian dwelling, you were going to build a dwelling that looked like a Victorian dwelling to house your enterprise. Today, funeral professionals who build a mortuary, it's going to look like some kind of commercial building. Right? It's going to look dignified. It's going to look clean, but is it going to look grand and residential? Probably not. And this is the dominant trend. But residential funeral homes still exist. I visited a great many of them, beautifully preserved buildings. And here's the thing about this, is that Back in the 1920s, the residential funeral home was at the forefront of a discussion around zoning. Right, zoning was brand new, and it was coming at the end of the Gilded Age. A new tool that cities and towns had to regulate and organize their urban landscapes. And the funeral home was at the center of that conversation. Many a zoning ordinance in the United States came into being because an enterprising funeral director tried to move into a residential neighborhood. And so that was the conversation that was taking place back then. Today, it's a different, fast forward 100 years, it's a different conversation. Today, funeral directors and funeral homes are at the center of a conversation around brick and mortar and the value of in-person modality. Of course, during the pandemic, families were barred. Funeral directors, of course, were frontline workers. And they would bring, of course, the bodies of the deceased into their funeral homes. Families were not allowed in any more than they were allowed into the hospitals, right? And so the Zoom funeral was invented. Now, people, of course, have gone back to holding in-person wakes and memorials. But will that continue, right? And here's where it gets complicated. As green burials become more common, today it's hard because most cemeteries will not allow green burials. They're going to want a concrete vault, and so you put a wicker casket or a shroud, a shroud wrapped body. You're still going to put them in a vault in the ground. Most municipal and private cemeteries require a vault. I probably can still count on one hand. I don't know, maybe it's expanded. There aren't that many cemeteries that allow direct earth burial, in other words. So green burial is still a novelty, right? It's still a novelty. Cremation is a big deal, and cremation was around 100 years ago, and the industry then was worried, would it cut into their profit margins? Because an urn costs less than a casket, right? And so cremation has always been, a challenge to the industry. Green burial presents a significant challenge. New ways of the final disposition, new methods of final disposition will challenge industry's profit margins. Now, why is this? Why is this important? It's important because these grand Gilded Age mansions are expensive to maintain. Historic preservation is expensive. I live in a Victorian. I know how expensive it is. Painting, upkeep, maintenance, porch posts rotting out. These are expensive. And as the industry sees its business model change, as cremation increases and as green burials increase, at some point it's going to become unsustainable for them to maintain these grand dwellings, or any brick and mortar for that matter. It's not just grand Victorian dwellings. And so there's sort of two conversations. I mean, do we as a society value in-person modality as opposed to remote and virtual? And are we going to continue to pay for expensive burial goods that will support financially the preservation of these residential funeral homes? I don't know the answer to either of those questions. But these are the questions that are posed by the residential funeral home in 2024, as opposed to 1924, where it was all about, do these belong in residential neighborhoods? These neighborhoods are changing. How is zoning going to regulate? Those were the questions back then. There is a different set of questions today.
Well, that is a wonderful way to leave it, because I think in a sense, it still poses the same question about preservation of these buildings, preservation of our past. And this is what I think makes your book so interesting and so much fun, is that we've come full circle in our conversation today. And I'm all the richer for this knowledge, even though I never would have thought I needed to know about funeral homes and funeral directors. So, Dean, thanks so much for joining the show.
I thank you so much. This has been a pleasure.
Well, that's all we have time for. Thanks for listening. You can follow the Gilded Age and Progressive Era on Twitter or on my website, michaelpatrickcullinane.com. Please consider subscribing or reviewing the podcast wherever you listen, because it really makes a big difference and helps direct others to the show. I hope you'll join me again for the next episode.